Hello, and welcome to our webinar today on intimate relationships, technology, and abuse, what a gender-based violence framework can teach us about online danger. This is part of a webinar series by the Grand Challenges for Social Work, particularly the Harness Technology for Social Good Grand Challenge. I am Kira Silk, the Director of Grand Challenges, and I am going to play a brief introduction from Stephanie Berzin, who is one of the co-leads for the Harness Technology Network.
My name is Stephanie Berzin. I am the Dean of the College of Social Sciences, Policy and Practice at Simmons University, which contains the School of Social Work. I am a co-lead for the Grand Challenge, Harness Technology for Social Good, which is sponsoring today's webinar. To kick us off, I wanted to provide a small bit of background around our Grand Challenge and why, in fact, we brought folks today together for this webinar. The Grand Challenges effort was launched about 5 years ago to bring social work together as a field in order to be able to look at what are the primary challenges for our field over a 10-year period for which we could make meaningful progress. There are 12 challenges that cover topics that include some particular social problems, and then our challenge, which is really one that's more related to the field more globally. Our challenge was designed as harnessing technology for social good. And the goal was really to begin to get social workers on a path to think about transformative change that occurred because of technology and how it would fundamentally alter our practice. The challenge is made up of two distinct groups, one that focused primarily on practice and how social work practice would fundamentally change as a result of technology, and the other group that was focused on big data. Why we came together was that we recognized as social workers, while the world was moving incredibly quickly in terms of information communication technology, it was fundamentally changing access, changing communication, changing where people received information. The field of social work had been slow to move forward in this progression. We feel there was an opportunity to really put time and energy toward bringing the practice forward through education, through research, through training. I'm just going to highlight for you a few of our main goals for what we hope to accomplish over the decade for which the Grand Challenges were designed. We're really interested from a policy perspective on opening up access, both around internet connectivity and practice across state lines, telehealth being one of those topics. We're interested from a policy standpoint around data linkages and sharing. Interested in data issues around how, in fact, we could train and attract social workers who could work with big data for social good, and how, in fact, we can use new technology-based interventions for practice. We wanted to make sure social workers were in fact controlling our destiny for how mobile apps and gaming and data would be used in practice. We also recognize that this is not the place for which we're the master of the domain, and instead that we hoped our Grand Challenge would begin to open up conversations between our profession and other sectors that are deeper in this work. There's already been a lot of work which the Grand Challenges have been part of, thinking about curriculum and pedagogy in this area, and we've been thinking more about how, in fact, we expand data access. This webinar is part of a series that we're beginning to host, and it's really part of that primary goal of how do we, in fact, develop, train, and retain a stronger group of social workers who are interested and more conversant with data and technology. Thank you so much, and welcome to everybody.
So yes, thank you all for joining. This is part of a series. It's the second in our series. And we hope that you will join us for future webinars as well. With that, I will turn it over to Megan Lindsay, who will lead us on our webinar today. Just bear with us while we transfer host abilities.
As a technology presenter, this is the most pressure I'll feel is the next 30 seconds or so. Okay, oh, there's my email. See, the one thing I didn't want to do. All right. Okay.
Hi, will we get copies of the information? Just wondering. This is Jamie from Kanta.
Hi, Jamie. I'm definitely happy to share the slides after the fact. I was tinkering and tweaking and piddling at the very last minute, but I'll definitely make sure that Kira has access to those as well, and we can send to the group.
Okay.
Wonderful, thank you. So I just wanted to quickly, sorry, go ahead, Kira.
I was just going to mention that the webinar will also be recorded and shared with all who registered, so you'll have access to the full presentation as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kira. And thank you for putting together and organizing this series. I'm really, truly excited to talk about the research I've been doing for the past 2 years in the area of technology and gender-based violence, and kind of link these two, actually two different grand challenges together. And so in order to get going, I thought it'd be nice for us just to have that refresher about what this particular grand challenge is all about. And I've definitely said to my students repeatedly and many times that I think of social workers as really the engineers of the social sciences. So while we've always had sociologists and anthropologists and political scientists and psychologists who've, you know, they've dabbled in working with people, they certainly do. Obviously, we draw a lot from psychology and we've learned from everyone across these disciplines, but social workers have always really started at meeting people where they're at and rising to the challenge. And so one of the things that excites me most about having this particular grand challenge incorporated is that we have an opportunity to be leaders in thinking about what has and hasn't worked with people. And so while many people bring theoretical expertise and they have experience with working across different groups, social workers have always tried to embody this sort of balance between problem solving in real time and then also you know, keeping a set of core values and ethics at the center of the way that we do bring services to populations. So we've always been tinkering ourselves, and I think when we're harnessing technology for social good, what we're really talking about is integrating the digital cultures that are already going to be existing and making sure that social workers have a voice at the table. So I'm honored and pleased to be here and talk about this particular grand challenge today. So just a quick introduction of who I am and what my research is all about. So I'm at ASU in the School of Social Work. I'm a research assistant professor, and I've worked under Dr. Jill Messing's supervision for the last 5 years, and I had what could be considered a very non-traditional postdoc. And so what I was able to achieve in this particular project that was handed to me was an opportunity to do community-based research, where essentially what we were doing was taking a piece of technology and launching it forward in the community. And so in Arizona, there are about 40 different domestic violence programs and shelters. And in 2015, we established an AmeriCorps program. And through that AmeriCorps program, our goals and objectives were essentially just to make sure that practitioners who really needed the support had extra ability and access to reach this population through evidence-based care. And we would do that by essentially promoting the app. So up in this very top right corner, you'll see we have the My Plan logo. And that's the online safety app that was developed in conjunction with Dr. Messing and other researchers. And I'll actually talk about that in more depth later on in the presentation. But first, I actually really wanted to give credit to the students and the community partners whom I work with. And I'm hoping that we have some of our folks from Arizona here on the call. But it really, anytime we do any kind of work that is for the greater good in social work or other disciplines, it really is always about bringing together different players and making sure that people have voice and accessibility to the kinds of change we're trying to make. And this lovely mural that you see, this was actually a National Day of Service. And so our students painted this at a community center here in Phoenix, Arizona. And it's a gorgeous piece of art, and it shows just what fantastic people we have at ASU and what kind of work we're capable of doing when we integrate our students as well into the mission statements that we embody. And then if you aren't familiar with the AmeriCorps program, we don't have time to go into all of it today, but I'm always happy to explain to people what AmeriCorps is and does and how it really complements social work and social work internships nicely. So that being said, my projects were to essentially help disseminate this piece of technology or this piece of research evidence out into the community. And then through this, we ended up building the scholarship program, SurvivorLink. And at this point, the program is about 6 years old, and we've distributed over $1 million worth of scholarships. We've had several students go on to take jobs in the community as advocates, and I have a real passion for seeing social workers shift their attention to and consider themselves advocates of domestic violence. Yeah, and then my research has always looked at the women's everyday lived experience, and my dissertation is actually about the developmental trajectories of young adult women. And this is a book that I helped to co-edit with my colleague Crystal Aberdeen in 2018. And so while my earlier research really did focus more on the positive implications and some of the more beneficial, rounded experiences that young women were having, I ended up shifting to and looking more closely at online harassment and gender-based violence in online spaces, because despite having very positive experiences and incorporating technology more than any other group, all young women sort of have this sort of rite of passage or this unfortunate experience where at some point they did experience online abuse as part of their, just interactions, their day-to-day life. It's just a part of women's life. And I thought that as a social worker, I wanted to really use my voice and my research as an academic to speak more to the kinds of change we can make based off of our expertise in intimate partner violence, and then also what these vulnerable populations need. So I like to try and straddle this realm between technology and communication, scholarship, social work, and then also just gender-based violence broadly. So today I'm going to come in with an assumption that I'm talking primarily to social workers and people who would have had some exposure or understanding about what intimate partner violence is, but we'll briefly talk about intimate partner violence and give it a definition. And then I'm going to define technology-based abuse as well and give you some examples. And then next I'm going to talk about Michael Johnson's typologies of domestic violence. And I want to explain how this particular theoretical framework can really help us to develop and move forward and progress our own agendas, both in research and practice. So, let's see. The definition of intimate partner violence, according to the World Health Organization, is essentially these four facets of domestic violence. And I'm going to say domestic violence and intimate partner violence probably interchangeably. And people in the community frequently refer to it as domestic violence. Intimate partner violence is meant to essentially assume that there's a romantic relationship or a romantic history between both parties. And we say intimate partner violence because it widens that umbrella, and it includes not only people who are married couples or who have cohabitated, but also people who are in dating relationships and maybe have not lived together. It does, if we're talking about domestic violence, that can also include family members. But in this instance and throughout the presentation, I'll be very specifically talking about intimate partner violence. So we are looking at people who have had a romantic history with one another. So there are four, there's a note from a participant. Oops. There are four essential areas for the for violence according to the World Health Organization. So these are acts of physical violence, sexual violence, emotional and psychological abuse, and then controlling behaviors. And then this definition doesn't actually include stalking, but I just wanted to note that the Centers for Disease Control does include stalking in their definition. So here in the United States, we actually do have a bit of a conception or internalization of violence as including stalking in addition to these other four behaviors. And then when I talk about the gender-based violence framework, essentially what I'm trying to get at is that we have a disproportionate amount of women who are experiencing victimization. And, there is much to be said about the theoretical disagreements amongst intimate partner violence researchers and family violence and those who have been working with these communities, but really the focus for today is about the experiences of women and how their victimization is an extension of and hinges off of the patriarchal structures that have essentially allowed intimate partner violence to continue. So, there's certainly good research and excellent experts in sources you can rely on to get into that further. But I'll just point out as well that even though amongst women, they predominantly as a group, they experience the majority of the victimization, one of the things that makes the differences, one of the key differences is the experience of sexual violence, which is higher for women, sustained injuries, physical injuries, and then also we have intimate partner homicide. And so this particular statistic we're looking at here, these are mass shootings that happened between 2009 and 2017. And this statistic is from Newtown. And actually all of the images you see are examples of people who had shown up and they committed a mass shooting and they, in their history, they had recent intimate partner violence, and then also oftentimes they were actually showing up to kill the woman whom they had a relationship with, or it was shortly after they had had a breakup or something of that nature. And what I wanted to point out is that the perpetrators themselves, like these come from an array of different ages, classes, and while we're going to talk briefly about intersectionality in a moment, I think that it's very relevant to think about technology not just as internet and cell phones and our access to new connected devices through the Internet of Things. Really, guns are a prominent technology in our social and cultural history in the US. And while, that is also in and of itself a separate training, I want you to think about how anytime we introduce a new technology and we make the power available to people, there's disproportionate violence based off of these types of cultural practices. So in this instance, this is actually the only documented social history that really can link together mass shootings, and it's all the more reason why in the US we can and should think of domestic violence as a public health issue, and we should be advocating for gun reform, not just for the safety of women in the relationships, but for our public safety as well. And it seemed, as I was working on this presentation, it seemed like it would be strange for me to skip over or not talk a bit about what's happening in this moment, because we are in this very particular historical, cultural context, this shared experience with one another. And I think, first I want to acknowledge COVID-19, and then also just how this is impacting intimate partner violence in communities, and then also the survivors who are in their homes. And so this is a statistic from the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And so they've seen an increase in calls from essentially the end of March until about the end of May. They've seen an increase of 9%. And I also wanted to highlight for you here, you can see that there's actually a multitude of ways that people are already reaching out and offering services for this population. So not only did they have 35,000 phone calls, they had 25,000 chats as well. And then next, I wanted to talk about Black Lives Matter and intersectionality. And while people, people think of intersectionality often as a form of describing and talking about identity politics, if you go to one of Kimberly Crenshaw's foundational readings from 1997, this is essentially her second follow-up publication after she talked about the legal conundrums for Black women's employment. She uses as her very next example the conflict that women of color face as they're a part of and excluded from the intimate partner violence movement. And what we need to think about and consider is that this conflict has existed from the very beginning. And even from the very inception of the Violence Against Women Act, there was conflict at hand because this was essentially tucked into the 90s crime bill. And intersectionality isn't just about people feeling, intersectionality is about the position someone has and their access and ability to power and the way that power clusters around certain groups and essentially subordinates other people. And so I just want to briefly just share one of the quotes from that 1997 reading. And Kimberly Crenshaw goes on to give several excellent examples of the complications of trying to work on domestic violence issues in the community. But in this reading, she says the concept of political intersectionality highlights that women of color are situated within at least two subordinated groups that frequently pursue conflicting political agendas. So the need to split one's political energies is something that men of color and white women seldom confront. And within the domestic violence professional communities that I know, and from what I understand nationally, this has really been at the forefront of people's mind for the last 5-10 years. And people are recognizing and understanding that the liberation of women and the ability to create safe spaces in the home is both personal and private, but also political. And you have to combine these agendas together and you can't treat them as separate. And then I wanted to share this, I wanted to share one more image here from, this is a picture of Aisha Evans in the Baton Rouge protest against Alton Sterling. So this was, years and years ago, but I've always been very struck by just her composure and her ability to confront police. I thought that this would be just a nice reminder that this isn't, as we talk about everything that's happening right now here in 2020, these are conflicts that have been born for a long time. And the use of police force in communities of colors have always particularly put an extra responsibility, or an extra burden, I should say. I don't want to say a responsibility, because it really isn't up to only women of color, but it's always presented a complication as they've had to try to merge together and lead us all through this maze of understanding how to bring change in both areas simultaneously. So we really can't think about changing or shaping domestic violence in a progressive or impactful and even effective way without also confronting the misuses of state police and the violence that actually happens in communities that would contribute to the interpersonal violence that women experience as they feel isolated from police as a source of trust and support. And then just briefly, I want to also mention that these are conversations, again, these are ongoing, these are long drawn conversations that are not new. And we know that not only do women have additional burden to essentially navigate this complex space of trying to move forward both political agendas, we know that their impact actually increases the rates of violence. So Black women are the highest group in the US for rates of homicide, and 55% of all homicides amongst this population come from an intimate partner. And then also, I think it's quite important for us to think about the context of also Black men, and 45% of Black women report some form of IPV in their lifetimes, but so do 40% of Black men. And so we have to just be very cognizant of how all of these things merge together. And I think that social workers should really be at the front of the intimate partner violence movement, because we've always looked at our ability to change through a lens of social justice. The last thing I wanted to touch on when we talk about intimate partner violence is just a reminder about the Duluth model. So this is sort of, this framework it's the gold standard. This has been in every shelter for many, many years now. And just a reminder that the cycle of violence within an intimate partner abuse situation, it always hinges not only on someone using physical violence, but using persistent threats and strategically employing acts of violence and terror in order to make the other person feel afraid or dominated. So really, power and control has been at the crux of all abusive relationships. And one of the things that we absolutely know, and something that has been borne out in the research, is even though there are disparities in impact when we look at gender, so we know that women are experiencing more victimization, it's power and control that really does allow another person to become dominant in that relationship. And we're going to talk about this at length when we get to the portion about the theoretical underpinnings. But I wanted to go ahead and actually define some of these areas of abuse for you. So we're talking specifically about technology-based abuse today. And when I use this term, I'm thinking of things that wouldn't have been possible without the new proliferation of the technologies that we use every day. So cell phones, internet, social media, all spaces, mediated spaces that didn't exist for us maybe 20 years ago. And what I want to do is think of how these 4 different forms, or these 4 or 5 different forms of violence are available and able to change the nature of abusive relationships. So Nancy Bain has her sort of the pinnacle book from 2010, the Personal Mediated Communications book. She talks about how if something is different and new because of technology, truly, if it's replicable, if you can, if it's archived, if it didn't exist before the internet, I mean, there's ways that we can and should be defining these forms of abuse because they weren't available to us. Anyways, so cyberstalking is essentially, it's the act of stalking has always involved monitoring someone or watching somebody closely. But cyberstalking essentially extends an activity that already existed in abusive relationships and makes it much more accessible for an abuser. So because we all naturally leave a trail of data behind us in our day-to-day lives, what can happen is that a partner can essentially exploit the networks and the archived information and data in order to track another person. And then online harassment is when there's repeated unwanted contact, sort of flooding of messages. This is essentially when someone just persistently is invading the other person's life. And cyberstalking and online harassment, all of these things really do sort of go hand in hand, and they're usually not isolated or techniques used on their own or just standing, but usually they're used in combination. And Next, I wanted to bring up doxing and swatting. And this is probably the least familiar term. And so doxing is when you essentially reveal a piece of private information in order to humiliate someone. So this, again, was something that you couldn't have done before, because essentially the act of doxing, it's the ability to instantly publish information and instantaneously reach entire networks of people allows for this type of humiliation. So while obviously people can and did find ways to humiliate and shame other people, it would have just taken a much greater effort and like physical, investment. Whereas now people can take a piece of private information and instantly send it to your employer or send it to everyone in your contacts list. So it's really, this networked humiliation is new. And doxing can span everything from private information like your banking and, how to oftentimes abusers will do, sort of these more creative techniques like giving your private information to solicitors so that you get sort of this nonstop call. So again, there's sort of this combination of harassment and doxing. And then swatting, this is when somebody actually calls the police and they file a fake report in order to get police to show up and hopefully aggressively show up and scare a victim. And then the last one I wanted to mention was sextortion and image-based abuse. So commonly people will call this revenge pornography. I'm trying my best to get us to just eliminate that term from our vocabulary because it implies that a victim deserves some sort of act of penance, and that's just not true. And so non-consensual pornography, that's how the Department of Justice defines it. This is when another person doesn't know that a sexual image or video or content is being released of them. And then sextortion, and again, this is actually a term from the Department of Justice. Sextortion is when somebody has access to these materials already, so they have an intimate photo or they have an intimate video and digital materials, and what they're doing is they're threatening. So they don't actually release it, but they just threaten to. And in the study from Ybarra in 2017, and the study was 15 adults who were 15 and older. So this did actually lump together some youth with an adult sample, but 1 in 10 young girls who were under 30 have been threatened to have a nude image released. And so even if we don't actually have people experiencing the victimization, we can already see this sort of just uptick in people using these as bargaining chips and just essentially really nefarious ways to control another person. And again, all of this abuse, it hinges on the intermittent acts of physical or sexual violence in order to create that coercive web of control. So there has to be the threat of violence and the fear that the violence would happen in addition to these tactics. But you can see how all of these forms of cyber violence and technology-based abuse, they really do extend the ability of an abuser to go into the realm of coercive control. So I wanted to make sure we stay on time, and I realize we're already a bit behind schedule, so I'm going to go quickly through these stories. Sorry, there's a suggestion from the audience. There's gray boxes. Sorry, are you guys able to see everything on the slide, Kira?
No, there's a couple boxes that are showing up. I don't know if there's things open or hovering that might be showing up on your screen.
Yeah, there's like a box covering the title on top.
Oh, interesting. So in this slide, can you see the image and then it's just cyber stalking has text over it, overlaid?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see the image, but it's just there's like a box covering the wording on top.
Oh, how obnoxious. I don't know what to do about that. I don't see the box as the issue. Well, like I always tell my students, I'm actually not really a tech expert. I can maybe, pontificate on how you feel about your tweets, but I'm really, I'm probably considered an amateur compared to most people who are, identified tech scholars. If I'm just going to ask the audience if you could interrupt if there's a piece of information missing. It'll be a bit clunky, and I can live with that. So I'm going to continue with just the story and make sure that we get through all of the research that I want to present today. But if I'm especially going over a figure that has numbers or there's something that's really unclear, let me know, and I can make sure that we I can see if I can fix it then or pay extra attention to it. So quickly, I'm just going to tell examples of each of these forms of abuse. So cyber stalking, just as I mentioned, this is when someone's already exploiting information they have access to. So in this instance, this is Ellen, excuse me, I'm going to forget her last name if I don't get to my notes. Oops. So this is Ellen Week. She's from Westchester, Ohio, and she contacted the police and let them know that she was receiving anonymous messages that made her feel fearful, and that the messages often contained video images of herself, and she was fearful that they were coming from her ex-boyfriend. So she went to police, clearly identified who the perpetrator was, told them about what the messages were, and shortly after, he did kill her. So this young woman was, unfortunately, she reported the stalking that was happening. She had evidence of the stalking, and unfortunately, the police didn't either act swiftly enough or take it serious or have the availability or the tools and resources in order to prevent this event from happening, the homicide. And then next, for online harassment, I want to talk about Phoebe Prince. And so this is sort of a classic example that's used to discuss cyberbullying, but when people couch this or house this as cyberbullying, they really miss the sexual politics behind the event that happened. Phoebe Prince was dating athletes at her high school. She was a new student from Ireland, and both the athletes that she had dated, the boyfriends that she had, and their presumed girlfriends who were sort of intermittent with Phoebe's relationship with these people, they launched a hate campaign amongst her peers, and they essentially released images and photos and constantly published and republished these images. And then Phoebe Prince ended up taking her own life out of just sort of the sense of helplessness and inability to have control. Next, I want to talk about Laura McCluskey. So this was an undergraduate student at the University of Utah, and she was dating a young man, and once she found out that he was actually on probation, she went to break up with him, and he was very upset by the breakup, and so he started to threaten her with releasing her nude images, and she called the police. And if you ever, if you have some time and you want to look into the story more, there's actually recorded calls from her to the police, and you can tell she's very composed and she doesn't sound fearful. And the campus police repeatedly brought this up. Well, she didn't say she was afraid, but she did say, excuse me, that she was very bothered at the idea that he might release the image, and she needed help. So she called the campus police, I believe, 4 times. And eventually her ex-boyfriend, and he asked for money. So, I mean, this is very traditional extortion. He said, if you don't give me a certain amount of money, I'm going to release these photos. Ms. McCluskey, after calling the police several times, her ex-boyfriend did show up at her dorm. He essentially grabbed her, put her in a car, and he killed himself, and he killed her as well. So these instances really are to be taken very serious and thought of in the context of intimate partner violence. You can see how these are actually indicators that somebody is maybe ramping up or escalating and preparing to harm another person. And then last is actually Zoe Quinn, and this is she's an independent video gamer, and if you're familiar at all with the hashtag Gamergate, you would know already who Zoe Quinn is. But I think, without getting into all of this was years and years and years of sort of this cultural clash on the internet, those back and forth between people who were driving the Gamergate hashtag saying that feminists were just attention seeking and essentially ruining video gaming, and then there was journalists saying that there was inherent sexism and problems with the industry. This controversy lasted for years, but what I wanted to point out to you is that amongst this community of online gamers, this all kicked off because Aaron Goji, her former boyfriend, he posted a lengthy blog post about their relationship where he essentially accused her of sleeping with someone in order to get publicity as a game developer. And this wasn't true. She hardly knew the person. This was all just an act of essentially insecurity and jealousy. And she then went on to have years and years of harassment based off of this ex-boyfriend's post. So there's some real life examples, and I wanted to show those pictures because this is something that's happening now. It's affecting people's real lives. But now I want to shift focus back to the intimate partner violence research and how this can actually teach us about ways to approach technology-based abuse. So Michael Johnson's typologies, he essentially breaks out violence into different subtypes based off of where the data are coming from. And so according to Michael Johnson, essentially the reason why there has always been this theoretical rift or this divide amongst intimate partner violence scholars is because some groups of scholars actually access people who are already self-identified as victims, and they're using court systems, they're showing up in emergency rooms, and they're at domestic violence shelters. And then when you compare those rates to population level data is how he presents it. When you look at more general and broad samples, the rates fluctuate or change, or the instances of violence actually look lesser. And so the point that Michael Johnson makes in his book is not to say that either that any violence is okay or acceptable, but rather that what we can learn is that there is repeated patterns within abusive relationships, and that escalated violence always contains an element of control. So this is that particular form of intimate partner violence is he describes it as intimate terrorism. You can read Stark as well, and Stark describes this as coercive control, but this is again another partner who's trying to dominate or essentially use power instead of negotiating or having any sort of real relationship with the person. They're just trying to access control. And there's constant threats and intimidation and monitoring in order to do this. And a key facet or characteristic in these abusive relationships is undermining the will to resist. And technology-based abuse is really at the heart of undermining survivors' ability or opportunity to leave by essentially making them feel as though they could never leave or get away. Violent resistance, this is when someone is experiencing this type of coercive control, or they have another person who's trying to employ the coercive control. And this actor essentially, in an attempt to regain their own sense of agency, they act out and use violence as a response. And these two people would be in the same relationship. So we're actually not talking about two different actors, but people who use violent resistance, they're not violent themselves in nature, but it's just after repeated acts of violence against them, they often will end up using these tactics over time. And then next is situational couples violence. And in this instance, Michael Johnson is talking specifically about how there are times when neither partner is actually trying to control the other person, and that no one has this essentially emotional dynamic where they're expecting or believing that they have more right the things that they want and desire, and that they're set out to subjugate the other party. But in situational couples violence, things essentially just become so contentious that the couple can't agree on an issue, and then the fight itself becomes violent. And I think I just want to make sure that we can understand this difference. Violent conflict essentially would happen amongst couples when things become contentious over time and a couple is having trouble working out those issues, but essentially a violent relationship would be when that controlling party or that person is trying to dominate the other party. And lastly, I do want to point out there is a gendered nature to all of the conflicts that surround situational couples violence. And so there's these common themes, and usually they have to do with relationship status, finances, children, and division of labor. And all of these, in my mind, even if you aren't thinking of situational couples violence as direct sexism, there's certainly just sort of this implicit patriarchal force at hand that's making it difficult for couples to negotiate this territory. And so I just wanted to show you this model briefly. Intimate terrorism, that orange box around the top figure, this shows the person who's trying to be coercive and controlling, and then that person is acting out in violence. And so the violence is directed at the other party. And then with violent resistance, that means that only one party is actually using coercive control, but both parties are using violence. So in examples 1 and 2, this is actually the same couple. And then when we look at example 3 and 4, situational couples violence, neither person is trying to use coercive control, so you don't see that arrow, right? But they're both essentially acting out and using violence from time to time in the relationship. And then last, we have mutual violent resistance. And I'm actually not going to go into this because this is only theoretical and there is no empirical evidence. This is just a suggestion that Michael Johnson has in his book. So I'm using this particular framework because there's evidence that there's similar patterns of rift in the literature for technology-based abuse as well. So here's actually, this is by no means a comprehensive chart. There's additional studies that just wouldn't fit, but this is sort of just this walkthrough literature starting back in 2005, 2004, and all of the blue boxes are quantitative studies that were conducted with people who would have been reporting some form of technology-based abuse. And above the top, those are all college student studies, and then below the bar in the middle, these are all studies done with people who are self-identified intimate partner violence victims. And what we see over time is that in these studies, as people are collecting quantitative data, there's a lot of discussion or talk about gender symmetry between men and girls until Reed starts presenting to other folks. And actually, she has another paper prior to this in 2015 where she starts to say, sure, if you just asked for the behavior and you're just counting the number of times, maybe it looks as though girls are cyber stalking more than boys. But when you ask for impact, if you ask them how they actually feel about it, young girls have more fear from the stalking. They feel like it could actually result in violence. And so this isn't to dismiss or say that cyber stalking coming from young women has no problem whatsoever, but just to remind everyone that if we don't contextualize the behavior with patterns over time, it can be very misleading, and it can actually, you can even mistake or see violence that's coming from someone who's technically a survivor trying to regain agency in that context. And then next, I just wanted to point out all of these purple boxes are actually qualitative study. So at the same time that we have this very broad reaching base of quantitative survey research happening with college students, we had almost none with people who are self-identified as intimate partner violence victims, and almost nothing from services, domestic violence shelters, courts. There's hardly any empirical documented information to talk about the rates of domestic violence as far as in that population or that subgroup. But we do have several prominent examples of ways that people are experiencing technology-based abuse to have further coercive control within their relationship. And so this pattern, this different methodology that just sort of naturally unearthed or emerged in the literature, it presented an issue for actually showing some of the more severe and long-lasting impacts of technology-based abuse, and who's experiencing maybe just the more extreme versions of technology-based abuse. So I'm going to actually skip through this pretty quickly. I do have noted here just some examples of times when people who are survivors have, here's some examples of those types from Johnson's theory of when someone would have been experiencing this. And this is actually, this blue pose from a survivor all the way back in 2005, and she essentially points to the fact that if you can't actually get away from your abuser, if he's going to essentially stalk you in perpetuity, all of your motivation to leave the relationship is gone. And so the ability to cyberstalk another person is absolutely fundamental, and it is at the cornerstone of that coercive control, because it helps the abuser to essentially employ omnipresence and make the victim feel hopeless about leaving. And then technology and violent resistance, again, it's very important to have this theoretical framework in order to make sure that we don't mistake acts of resistance as violence directed towards somebody who is actually the one acting out to gain coercive control. So in this article, this is a stalking article from my colleagues and I at ASU, and in this instance, essentially a survivor at a shelter described, and even though the questions weren't explicitly about technology, and that wasn't actually the purpose of this qualitative interview, it did just come up naturally that she would be actually tracking and watching where her abuser was in order to make sure that her and her children were still safe. So it was actually her child had his password, and they would kind of just monitor him on Facebook to make sure that they were able to stay away from him. And then last, there are sort of just this, again, there is one study, I shouldn't say there's no studies of technology-based abuse. There is one study I mentioned earlier, that Ybarra study from 2017, where there's questions explicitly about digital abuse. And in that study, what was shown is there is a gender parity when you look at actual just general rates overall. But once you dig down even into this study, the rates for men and women, they really differentiate by type. So young women are experiencing much higher rates of sextortion, or essentially threatening to have their photos released or having them released. And so young women and girls often bear the brunt of a different type of online violence than young men do. So what will this do for our ability to better understand intimate partner violence and essentially look at coercive control? And again, as I mentioned, I think that it's really fundamental that we pay attention to what this coercive control is doing to disrupt people's day-to-day life and making it harder for survivors to access their services. So we did a study here in Arizona, and I'm going to talk very quickly and these findings actually rather quickly as well, just because I want to make sure that we need some time for questions. But we had 22 different sites where we collected data with people who had been self-identified survivors. And we did this as part of a randomized controlled trial in order to test that MyPlan intervention. But I'm going to specifically talk about the findings that we have regarding technology-based abuse, just because this is one of the only studies in the United States where we have quantitative research about technology-based abuse among adults who are survivors. So it was a randomized control trial, and we do have two different groups. And I actually am going to begin with the sub-analyses. First, let me just say briefly about the sample. Because we were in a shelter, we did have people who were primarily unemployed, and almost everyone, or 35% were making less than $100 a month. Almost everyone in our sample had children, and it was relatively racially diverse. It mirrors very much the city of Phoenix, where we had predominantly white, and we had African American and Hispanic people staying in the shelters who were participants in the study. So we used an exploratory technology-based abuse measure. So essentially there was 15 items that asked about more severe forms of intimate partner violence. And we developed the items, and we actually made this content based off of the literature and what was being presented in the qualitative studies about IPV survivors. So these are more extreme abusive tactics. We didn't ask any questions about what could be considered online intrusion or sort of that more innocuous social surveillance and monitoring, but we asked very explicitly about things that were direct threats or direct harassment tactics used by people in abusive context. So within our study, 33% of the total sample actually experienced some form of digital sexual coercion. And so that was like, has your partner pressured you or asked you for sexual acts that you didn't feel comfortable with repeatedly on messages? 75% experienced aggression, and 79% total in the entire study reported some form of monitoring and control. The fact that this is the highest, again, just goes to show that the technology is really about furthering coercive control. And so if you find an abusive relationship, you're probably no doubt bound to find technology-based abuse within that context. So then the question, I mean, that seems like a pretty obvious statement, because of course, if the relationship itself is already abusive, we're going to find technology-based abuse. But what we're trying to get at is that there are activities, behaviors, and things that people do online because they're in an abusive relationship that most of us would never even consider. So how can we really define what those severe forms are? So here we did run some Pearson chi-square, and this was actually just a subgroup of the broader sample, because we were looking at the MyPlan intervention. The intervention itself has the danger assessment, which is a psychometric tool to predict severity and lethality within an intimate partner violence situation. And so this is only actually a subgroup of the larger study, but we did find that those people who were in the intervention group, there was associations between physical abuse and monitoring and direct aggression, as well as severe abuse. So people who were in severe abusive situations were 16.4 times more likely to experience monitoring or that sexual coercion and pressure of messaging. And then I think probably most significantly, and this is really quite important just because no one's ever looked at lethality, people who reported forms of technology-based abuse were 4.6 times more likely to have a high score or a high likelihood that their intimate partner might come and kill them, or there would be intimate partner homicide down the road. And then the second set of analyses, and we're actually still in the process of finishing up, there will be 3 phases of analyses, but the second set of analyses was a latent class analysis. And just because time is getting brief, I'm going to continue to go really quickly, but because there's been some issues with the images, please just speak up if you're having a hard time seeing the table, and I'll make sure and do a better job reading some of the findings so we don't miss out on that. But essentially what we had here was 3 groups emerged from our data. And this is actually the broader sample of everyone who reported any form of technology-based abuse. And in these 3 classes, the first class, I would categorize this as essentially like mediated conflict or technology-based conflict. And essentially what happened is everybody had at least some record of being emotionally abused. So anyone who reported any technology-based abuse, they all experienced what would have been emotional abuse through their messages. So there's always going to be these sort of heated conflicts or the archived messages of people who are having these intense fights. But an additional 2 classes emerged after that. And the first group, the technology conflict, this was actually the smallest group in the sample. The second group is, I'm calling this a surveillance class. And so in this group, there are really persistent reports of their partner using their online spaces, devices, and the networks that are already in their day-to-day life to essentially check up on them consistently, to threaten physical harm. In this instance, they were monitoring their interactions with other people, and they were pressuring to share passwords, or they had essentially gone through the other party's cell phone without permission. And then the last group, the last latent class that I want to talk about is harassment. You could really think about this as technology abuse, harassment plus surveillance, because amongst this group, they experienced all of the surveillance techniques. And in addition to that, there were really specific harassment techniques that would have been used as a set, I'm assuming, and we don't actually have information about this yet, but what we could hypothesize is that these actions were used in order to regain control, potentially during a relationship dissolution or during a breakup, or just to act out as to stand in as that act of violence in order for the partner to communicate to the other party, I would be willing to hurt you. I am so invested in controlling you that I will hurt you, and you need to know that I'm serious about that. And so here we have people who have experienced having their private information exposed, they've had intimate photos exposed, or they've had someone threaten to do those things as an act of harm. So the next analyses in the next phase we'll be doing, we are going to be running an ANOVA and looking to see if those classes have associations with certain and specific types of abuse. I just wanted to keep everyone on the edge of their seat and make sure that they're going to read the paper when it comes out. I'm going to just peruse through some information about our intervention. And I'll just tell you that you can find a great deal of information on our website. We also have social media pages for the MyPlan online safety planning tool. But essentially what this tool is it's a combination of three different researchers' brilliant ideas. And so we have two nurses. One is Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, Dr. Nancy Glass, and Dr. Jacqueline Campbell is actually, she's the one who wrote the danger assessment, those 20 items. And so there are, 30,000 different hits for the danger assessment when you look. I mean, there's years and years and years of research, and we know that the danger assessment isn't perfect, but it works pretty well at predicting intimate partner homicide and severity of abuse. And then what Dr. Nancy Glass is, she combined the danger assessment with the decision aid. And so essentially what this does is it's an activity used in health settings to help people make complicated choices when there really is no right or wrong. And people who are experiencing intimate partner violence, the obvious go-to is just leave your partner. But as we just discussed, when you leave your partner, that's the most dangerous time of all. So when and how you leave the partner is very important. And so what the MyPlan app does is it doesn't just encourage people to leave, but it helps them think through different techniques and ways to do it safely and gets them connected to resources in their area. There have been, and then lastly, we have the tailored safety plan. So Dr. Jill Messing here at ASU has helped to develop the safety strategies based off of years of research on what advocates are telling their clients to do and what's working effectively and what's not. And so just by downloading this app, we have the ability to reach any survivor who at any point wants to know if their relationship is abusive. They'll have access to the danger assessment, and then they'll have the opportunity to go through this activity that will help them decide what their priorities are. And then last, they'll get connected to resources. And we're in the process right now. MyPlan has a partnership with the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And the next step is that soon here in the US, we'll be able to have people type in their zip code, and where they would essentially be given a list of all of the shelters and programs within their state, zip code, what's happening right around them. And so this is always meant to actually encourage advocacy and connect people back to advocates, not to replace them. There's been many quantitative studies about MyPlan, and so if you want more information about that, I'm happy to share that at a later date. I just want to quickly just mention, these are things that all survivors can and will benefit from immediately if we make sure that we advocate for survivors remaining in the space instead of putting the onus on them to just leave if they feel that they're in danger. So if we make it safe for domestic violence survivors to go online, they can avoid social isolation, which is a major technique and tactic of abusers. They can have continual contact with their advocates and their social workers and caseworkers. They can find help more readily. They can work flexibly. So many of them have employment issues, or maybe they've been out of the workforce for a while, but these are opportunities for them to start, trying something different, and perhaps they can find a work from home gig. They can refine their own story. So essentially owning and describing what happened to you is a major part of healing. And this gives them a chance to connect with other survivors. And they can practice boundaries in mediated spaces. So especially working alongside a social worker or a clinician, they can have those discussions about when and how things are unfolding in their future relationships. And they can really sort of draw that out and talk about, when do I give someone my phone number? Why do I want to send them a nude photo? Is it because I'm ready, or are they pressuring me? Am I, am I in a habit of doing things still when I feel pressured? So those are just some quick suggestions that I have. And then there are specific policy recommendations from the Grand Challenge. And then last, I just want to point out that there are suggestions from advocates about ways that we can better tackle the issues of technology-based abuse, including additional training, education, affordability for device and contract replacement. So essentially shelters helping to give out phones, and then expansion of existing resources, and then also just the regulation of abuse. And so I think it's really important for social workers to very cognizantly think about and listen to what victims are telling them, which is really the core of advocacy. And in a study by Fran Danis in 2005, I believe, she surveyed social workers and asked them if they saw themselves as victim advocates. And even though 80% reported that they had seen some form of intimate partner violence or sexual violence on their caseload, only about 10, I believe it was actually 20%, only 20% of those social workers described themselves as a victim advocate. So I think all social workers need to strive to be victim advocates no matter where your setting is. We are absolutely the front line for this issue, and we kind of should be the front line for changing our digital and social cultures as well. So I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. We have about 3 minutes according to my cell phone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan. I think this has been really wonderful, and there's been lots of appreciation in the chat function and Q&A. I want to remind everyone that they will receive a recording and the slides by email, so that hopefully any gaps that were missing through those boxes can have some questions answered. But we do encourage you to share any questions, ask any questions you might have. There was one question about an abbreviation, IBA. It goes back pretty far, but.
Yes, no, I'm so glad. IBA is image-based abuse. So I was talking very quickly, but this is sort of the replacement term for non-consensual pornography or revenge pornography. And I just particularly don't like when people use the term pornography, because in my mind that implies production, right? It's actually like a piece of media produced for entertainment. But really, there's good research, and there's good reason for people to be sexually expressive online or to essentially have sexual exchanges without it being thought of or talked about as though it were pornography, which is a genre of media, not necessarily expression. So image-based abuse, that is IBA. Oh.
Clarifying that. Any other final questions?
And thank you for that question. I'm glad I had a chance to clarify.
Right, mostly just a lot of thank you notes coming in. So
cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. If you stuck it out that whole hour, I'm impressed. I'm a storyteller. I like to get into the cases, and I think that it's really, there's much more you can do if you're out in the field than we can do in academia. And if there's anything I can do for advocates who are on the line or people who are social workers, I'm so interested in knowing what we can do to better understand victims and have a direct connection to them.
Well, we did just receive a question on that note a little bit. What advice can we provide to social work students placed in domestic violence shelters with no prior experience?
So I think, there is really a great deal of resources available through the National Network to End Domestic Violence and also the National Domestic Violence Hotline. I strongly recommend, if someone's going to a domestic violence shelter, that they think about trauma-informed care, and also technology is a form of trauma, a way to deliver trauma-informed care. So one thing that we've consistently heard when people have used the app is that the ability to share the story of their abuse without having to relive it for another person is actually very empowering. So technology can actually help us with trauma-informed care. And then also every single state has a coalition, and sometimes the states have what is called a dual coalition, both sexual and domestic violence, and sometimes it's just domestic violence. But I would definitely connect with the state coalition and see what trainings are in your area.
Thank you. One final question I see is around whether you've noticed that police are taking cyber abuse more seriously.
I think this is definitely a complicated area. Obviously, policing is complex for all of us right now as we think about the role of what police can do. I hadn't seen until the last 2 years, but there are actually people being hired and designated specifically for things like monitoring social media or understanding the use of digital, online harassment and those sort of digital harms. My fear is that it's being misused potentially as a tool. And I got an email this morning from the ACLU about a man who was arrested because his driver's license picture came up in a database of faces, and then essentially online the algorithm misidentified him. And so we have just sort of this, again, extension of the racism that existed in the policing before being, mucked up and interwoven with our technology. And so suffice it to say, I think there's unfortunately several examples of people who are police officers not taking intimate partner violence or sexual violence serious enough generally, and that would absolutely apply for cyber abuse as well. But there are certainly very good police officers as well. And I think the best thing we can do, in my mind, is to really speak readily and firmly and confidently whenever we talk about these issues, and work very hard to just let go of that internalized sexism we have about women not being sexual people, because so much of the shame that can be carried and is carried in these instances it's about the fact that women aren't supposed to be sexual, and that becomes the focus. Why did they take the photo? What were they thinking? So redirecting towards the perpetrator.
One last question, and hopefully is a good wrap-up one, but are there any specific research areas that you would like to see from the computer science side in this area? Anything that is missing in your eyes?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So much. I think that it's more just a matter of better collaboration. And I believe that my colleagues and people in disciplines of communication, I've probably had a better go at this, or tapping in and bridging those gaps. But I would just say that it's really, really important that we don't adopt and think of all social problems as though they are technology solvable. And so having an engineer working on a social issue such as this, the most common thing I would say is that people misunderstand what is safety and who is dangerous for women. And so social workers are constantly educating people about where danger really comes from. And it's not, especially with sexual violence and domestic violence, it's not someone jumping out from behind the bushes. And so there's a group of researchers at the University of the College of London, and I'm thinking of my colleague's name right now, but I'm not sure if I'm getting her school right, but they have an entire body of research coming out about the Internet of Things. And they do an excellent job collaborating with computer scientists as well. But essentially I don't know if we can't just make a device to keep people safe. We have to have cultural shifts and changes. And actually the devices that are often intended to be helpers become tools essentially misappropriated by abusers. So anytime we develop the access for people, thank you so much, at UCL, they're actually on the call, wonderful. So anyone who's developing a tool for convenience and essentially infringing on privacy, if they don't think about especially how that's going to be misused in abusive relationship context, there's just a real danger at hand. And I think that they should rely on people who are experts about abusive relationships.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, for leading us through this webinar. We really appreciate all the time you took to share your wealth of information and your research. And we hope that all the participants and attendees are excited and engaged, and look forward to hopefully seeing you all on our future webinars. You will receive an email that includes a link to the recording of the webinar, as well as the slides and links to register for future webinars as well, so that you can have that at your fingertips. And we just want to thank you all again for joining.